Good afternoon. My name is David Lee, and I'm the Director of Education for the Dallas Historical Society. Founded in 1922, we collect, preserve, and exhibit the heritage of Dallas and Texas to educate and inspire present and future generations. For more information about the Dallas Historical Society and upcoming programs, please visit our website, www.dallashistory.org. If you're an educator and would like to receive continuing education credits for today's lecture, please make sure that you've signed in the lobby and pick up your certificate at the conclusion of today's event. Welcome to the first Brown Bag Lecture of 2024, presented by Belmont Village Senior Living. Elected to the Texas Institute of Letters in 1993, two of his fellow inductees were James Michener and Bill Moyers. Mike Cox is the best-selling author of more than 40 nonfiction books and hundreds of magazine articles, newspaper columns, and essays. In recognition of his body of work, Cox received the A.C. Greene Lifetime Achievement Award in 2011. Two of his books, a work on Texas disasters and a 2-volume history of the Texas Rangers, are included in 101 Essential Texas Books by Glenn Dromgoole and Carlton Stowers. In 2022, he was listed in Who's Who in America. Cox's most acclaimed works are his 2-volume Texas Ranger history, Wearing the Cinco Peso and Time of the Rangers, and a true crime book on professed serial killer Henry Lee Lucas, The Confessions of Henry Lee Lucas. His book with Dean Smith, Cowboy Stuntman from Olympic Gold to the Silver Screen, won 3 national awards, including the Will Rogers Medallion in 2014. A former award-winning newspaper reporter, Cox served as Chief of Media Relations for the Texas Department of Public Safety and later Communications Manager for the Texas Department of Transportation before retiring in 2007. Retiring from retirement in 2010, he went back to work for the state as a spokesperson for Texas Parks and Wildlife. He left the 9-to-5 world for good in February of 2015 to write full-time. A native of Amarillo, Cox's parents met as reporters for competing newspapers while covering a sensational murder trial in West Texas. Cox grew up in Austin, where he began his newspaper career as a high school newspaper columnist and copy boy for the Austin American-Statesman. While attending Angelo State University, he worked full-time for the San Angelo Standard-Times. At the beginning of his junior year, he transferred to Texas Tech University, where he attended class during the day and worked nights at the Lubbock Avalanche Journal. He returned to Austin in 1970 after being rehired by the Austin Daily. He began his second career as a government spokesperson in 1985. When not writing or traveling, Cox spends as much time as he can fishing, hunting, prowling antique malls and bookstores, and looking for new stories to tell. Now living in the Texas Hill Country town of Wimberley, Cox's goal is to keep writing at least 1 book a year until he runs out of ideas or time. It is my very great pleasure to welcome author, historian, journalist Mike Cox to the Dallas Historical Society.
You know, no matter how many times I've heard it, every time I hear somebody read my introduction, I think about a wonderful line that I heard or read about Lyndon B. Johnson when he was president. Of course, being president of the United States, he got glowing introductions most of the time when he gave a speech. And after one of them, he said, you know, after listening to that, he said, I think about my parents. Said my mother would have believed that and my father would have appreciated it. So a question I always ask when I talk to a group is, how many people are from Texas? Okay. That's very helpful to me because I know how much lying I can get away with. So. And you probably, you may be a little weary of listening to speeches where the speaker is using a teleprompter. We've had several occasions lately that attracted a pretty large audience. So let me assure you, I'm just going to talk the old-fashioned way. May read a little bit at points, but I'm not going to use teleprompter. Finally, I'm happy to be here in Dallas. I actually lived here for a time, and excuse me. I actually lived here. I went to third grade in Dallas, over in Oak Cliff. But I want to talk to you today. I mean, there's many ways that I could talk to you about the Texas Rangers. So what I'm going to try to do is a combination that I always try to follow in my books, which is to certainly give you some information, but at the same time tell stories. I mean, I'm supposedly a storyteller, and I like telling the stories. So I've done a lot of research, obviously, of course, on the history of the Texas Rangers, and most of you probably familiar with what goes into research. It's, going through old documents, old papers, old files, new books, old books, all that sort of thing. But there's another component to research that I think is my favorite, and that is the adventure that sometimes comes when you're doing research. And so one adventure I can tell you about happened about this time last year. A friend and I and some lay archaeologists and lay historians and also genealogists and family members were down in Fayette County near LaGrange, not too far from the Colorado River, and we were looking for the remnants of a log cabin at which Stephen F. Austin signed one of the most important documents in Texas history. So what we wanted to do, our goal was to see if we could find any artifacts that might date to the colonial era in Texas, glass or pieces of pottery, and then also see if there were any remnants whatsoever of the cabin itself. At some point in the past, the cabin was mostly raised, but as we discovered in looking around, the old farmhouse that we were looking at, which also had pretty much fallen down, had been built on the original, looks like the original log framework of the log cabin. And we could tell that the logs were hand hewn, and the stones that were holding up the frame were hand chiseled. So to do some of this archaeological hunting, I brought a metal detector, and when I started using the metal detector, I pretty quickly realized that the batteries, I had not replaced the batteries, they had run down, and so they were pretty much out in the middle of nowhere. There was a really large field of corn surrounding this location, and in fact we had to walk through a narrow path through that corn to get from where we had parked our vehicles to the point where this old farmhouse once stood. And we'd already made, everybody in the group had walked there once, of course, and then when I found out I didn't have any batteries, the only thing I could do is walk back down it and rush into LaGrange real quick and buy some batteries, come back. And so as I was walking on this path, it had rained real heavy the night before, and there was a strong north wind blowing. It was early April. As I was walking this path, thinking about setting up my metal detector, all of a sudden I saw something white kind of expand and appear only 2 or 3 feet from my feet. And I, of course, focused on that because it was, startled me. And I looked down and it was a water moccasin. So since about 1910, I've been a concealed handgun carrier. So I proceeded to get into a gunfight with a water moccasin, which is, you don't hear about that very often. But when you think about trying to hit a snake with, a 9mm bullet, it's not like you had a shotgun, let me tell you. So the first shot I missed, and he continued to act aggressive. The second shot I missed, and so it was really getting to be quite a gun battle. Finally, on the third, I'm satisfied that I put him out of the biting business. And, you know, I used to work for Parks and Wildlife, so I fully understand the importance of venomous snakes in our Texas ecosystem, and really, I hate to do something like that. But at the same time, my daughter was with me, and there were a lot of other people there who had walked past this same area already and would be walking past it again. So that's how history can become can turn into an adventure. Well, so what document, or why was this site important? Well, as far as is known, in August of 1823, Stephen F. Austin signed this document, which I will read from one of my new books. He said, "I have determined to augment my own with my own private expense the company of men which was raised under the order of the late General Tres Palacios for the defense of the colony against hostile Indians. I therefore by these presents give public notice that I will employ 10 men in addition to those employed by the late governor to act as rangers for the common defense. The said 10 men will form a part of Lieutenant Moses Morrison's company, and the whole will be subject to my orders." Well, in Texas Ranger historydom, that document is considered the Magna Carta of the Texas Rangers. And so hopefully, and we did find some artifacts there, but the couple of archaeologists who were there said that they were maybe up to the mid-19th century, but not into the 1820s. But turned out there was a lot of metal in the ground, and I discovered, I didn't know this until this happened, that when there's a lot of metal, the ferrous material will start dissolving over time in the earth, and that spreads the metal particles, and so you get all kinds of weird signals on a metal detecting machine. So, you know, we might not have. I'm sure if a professional group of archaeologists came in there and did a professional dig, I think this well could be the site. And if it is the site, it's really one of the most important historic sites in Texas. And right now, it doesn't have a historic marker. It's on private property, and like I say, virtually unknown. So that's one of the fun things that I was able to do during that time. Well, to give you just a brief overview of the Texas Rangers, I decided for this latest book I did, which is called Boots, Badges, and Bullets. It's a collection. It was intended to be on the occasion of the 200th anniversary of the Texas Rangers, which was in 2023. But through various circumstances, not all of them under my control, the book didn't come out until late last year, and I'll get in a minute to more issues with that. But so I try to do in this the same thing I told you that I want to do, a combination of history and storytelling. I know that I'm sure y'all are interested in history or you wouldn't be here, but it's been my experience that a lot of people find history boring. I don't know how that could be true, and I tried very hard with my daughter to take her to every historic site in Texas, but I could never really turn her into a history buff. Really, my only failings as a father, she never learned to drink coffee, she never got deeply interested in history, and she doesn't watch professional football. But other than that, she's a charming young lady about to become a doctor. So I've broken down the history of the Rangers into what I call 6 bullets. The first bullet is that, as much as we might want to believe so, the concept of ranging was not invented in Texas. I tell people I believe that we improved it quite a bit, but the concept actually came across the pond from the English area into the east, and then down the eastern seacoast, and then west through the south into Texas. There it was matched up with Spanish law enforcement techniques and philosophies, and then also Mexican philosophies and techniques. So it became a little something different than other ranger organizations in that it had all aspects of the beliefs of these cultures. And so what these first rangers were about from the early 1820s through the time that Texas became a independent republic was, of course, dealing with hostile Indians. And so they were a combination during this period, this first period of volunteers. There wasn't really despite what Austin said, there wasn't any sort of significant paid funded organization. It was all during the time of his colony. Well, the next bullet comes in 1835, and I could make a pretty strong argument that really, despite all the hoopla we went through for the Ranger Bicentennial last year, that the real anniversary of the Texas Rangers ought to be not until 2035 or bicentennial. And that's because 1835 was the first year that the Republic of Texas Congress organized a force of Rangers who were considered to be, semi-professional Texas troops, and they were paid some, and that's really when, between 1835 and Texas statehood in 1845, that's really when the Rangers began to earn the reputation that they still have today. So that was the second bullet, this era between 1835 and up to 1845. The third bullet is that after statehood, there were always Texas Rangers of some stripe. Sometimes they were funded by the state, sometimes they were funded by the feds, but they operated independently from the federal government or in conjunction with. But for the first 50 years of their existence, from the mid-1820s up through actually 1881, the Rangers were primarily Indian fighters. Now, toward the later years, toward the mid to late 1870s, that pretty much had gone away. The last fight with the Indians was in January of 1881 out in the mountains of the Trans-Pecos. And that was against Apaches. But the main foe that the Rangers dealt with since forever was the Comanche people. So that in 1874, with the Indian fighting or Indian hostility still an issue, but a soon-to-be waning issue, the Texas legislature decided for the first time to give Texas Rangers law enforcement authority. Prior to that time, they were, as I said, mostly volunteered or low-paid, primarily Indian fighters. I can only find one or two instances in the 1830s, early 1830s, and through most of the 30s, where the Rangers did anything even remotely related to law enforcement, which was to occasionally pursue cattle thieves and try to recover stolen cattle. But that certainly was not their main reason for being at that time. But as I said, in 1874, the legislature created what was known as the Frontier Battalion, and it was made up of 6 companies from using the alphabet, and they were under a major, and that major reported to the Adjutant General of Texas. So the Adjutant General operates all of the state's military, what we now call the National Guard. And so for a long time, the Rangers were under the Adjutant General, who was the ultimate authority, though there was always somebody with the title of either Senior Ranger Captain, or in the case of the most famous of this Frontier Battalion era was John B. Jones, who was the first major in charge of the Rangers, and indeed went a long way toward establishing their reputation. Well, finally, in 1877, things had calmed down enough where the management or the leadership of the Rangers issued an order that henceforth their primary focus should be law enforcement, because the bill that gave them their name and their organizational structure did say that they would be duly commissioned state law enforcement officers. So that's when the Rangers began dealing with outlaws, which was not a growth career in Texas during the 1870s and 80s. The Rangers, for instance, dispatched some of the more noted desperados in Texas at the time, and captured others who would later on be dispatched by somebody else. So that it was but they were all over everything. One thing people believe is that, the Rangers only went after cattle thieves, or only investigated murder, or only investigated robberies, but they had their hand occasionally in almost any kind of felony crime, and occasionally even just some misdemeanors. They could arrest somebody for being drunk, or doesn't get much publicity, but the Rangers arrested a fair number of people for fornication or adultery. If somebody you could actually get filed on, and it was a criminal offense. So it's kind of contrary to the image you have of a Rangers out there, chasing the bad guys on horseback to the theme of William Tell's overture. But anyway, that gets us to approaching 1900, which is the next bullet, and that is that they began to progress from not only, Indian fighting was over, and then they began to find other ways to enforce the laws of the state. And also they were dealing with the fact that in the early 1900s, Texas was beginning to turn toward the motor vehicles rather than horses. So for a while, there was something of an anachronism, and there have been various periods in Ranger history, and one of them came in the late 1890s and early 1900s, where there was quite a clamor to disband the Rangers and do away with them under the idea that they had fulfilled their original purpose and were no longer needed, which proved to be a misguided idea, and unfortunately for Texas. Obviously we still have Texas Rangers. But in addition to their law enforcement duties, when the Mexican Revolution broke out in 1910, the Rangers were very active on the border, and really during that period of time created much of the dark aspect of Texas Ranger history, which we have all heard about, and I'll discuss a bit more in a minute. But certainly there were not always noble times back then in that period. Then in the 1920s, Texas entered the oil era, and after the Spindletop boom in 1901, several Rangers were sent to Beaumont in that general area down there to try to calm down the rowdy oil field workers. Whenever a boom town occurs, well, not only do hardworking blue-collar people come to town, but those who would try to make some money off of these hardworking people would also come to town. The prostitutes and the gamblers and the fraudsters, and which could range all the way from just a street level sort of thing all the way up to a corporate fraud. Then as we moved into the 1930s, the Rangers were increasingly falling behind the times, because bank robbers like Bonnie and Clyde, and there were others, could use high-power Ford cars to hit a bank and then, disappear long before most of the time law enforcement could arrive, especially the Texas Rangers. This was just the beginning of the era where law enforcement got radio technology. But even early on, the radios in some law enforcement vehicles were only receivers. They couldn't transmit back. So they were really shackled in a lot of ways. They didn't have a crime lab. There were only only the larger cities in Texas could offer that. Beaumont, for instance, was a pioneer in the use of fingerprints in Texas. The Rangers used the Fort Worth Police Department a lot, and also ditto San Antonio Police and Dallas Police, and I'm sure down on the coast of the Houston Police Department. But they were not they were not at their best. And another thing that was really began to hamstring them was politics. They were appointed by the governor, either indirectly or directly. The adjutant general, who was appointed by the governor, could appoint rangers, but the governor himself could appoint rangers. And so, especially during the administration, first of Paul Ferguson, and then later on in the 20s and early 30s under Ma Ferguson as governor, they had something like 2,000 special rangers and maybe 50 real rangers. Almost all of those special rangers were political appointees or political people who would be willing to pay the Fergusons for the privilege of serving as a special ranger. So it was not a bright time in the history of the Texas Rangers, though there were moments. There's always been moments, but in general, the early 30s were not at their peak by any manner of means. So then, realizing all this, the legislature actually did something that would benefit the people of Texas, and that is they hired a consultant from Chicago to review really all aspects of the government structure in Texas. One of their studies was on law enforcement, and this consulting firm in the Windy City said that, you really need to redo your state law enforcement. It needs to be professionalized. They need crime labs. They need better equipment. They need better standards, on and on and on, anything that you would expect of a modern law enforcement agency. So finally, the legislature not only took that advice, but in 1935, they acted on it and passed a law that created the Texas Department of Public Safety, which of course is still with us today. And the law moved the Texas Rangers from the Adjutant General's office to this newly created state agency, the DPS. It also moved the newly created Texas Highway Patrol, which at that time was operated by the Highway Department. It moved those uniform officers under the DPS. So for the first time, the DPS had both uniformed officers, it had both uniform officers and the Rangers in their plain clothes. The great historian Walter Prescott Webb, who wrote the first book on the Texas Rangers, it came out in 1935, just after this measure was passed, and he incorrectly predicted that would mark the end of the Texas Rangers. And of course, now we're approaching 100, we're only basically a decade away from 100 years since that point, and the Rangers are still there. So post-1935 is when the Rangers really did start to professionalize, and with each passing decade, they got more and more professional. They had better equipment, and like I said, literally decade by decade. I think they hit their high point personally in the 1950s, especially the Texas Rangers. Throughout the 1950s, essentially, defendant rights had not yet been invented in Texas. There was no such thing as a Miranda warning. You could just arrest somebody and however you did it, get them to confess to a crime. And they just had a lot of also clout just in terms of their reputation, which has been developing over the years. And so they were pretty autonomous. I mean, and they were under the direct control of Homer Garrison, who was the director of the DPS at that time. And he ran a straight organization when a Texas Ranger in the 1950s actually got kidnapped by a bank robber. Once the guy escaped, the first thing Garrison did was fire him. He said, a Texas Ranger doesn't get kidnapped. He said, we'd rather put on a funeral for you than deal with the tarnish to our image of a Texas Ranger being fired for pretty much just cause, even though I'm sure he could not have really helped it, but at least he didn't. It cost him his career. So we move all the way up, and then we get to, that would be our final of the six bullets. But there's four broad categories that I look at of roles that the Rangers have played over the years. The first one is as defenders. As I said, and have repeated several times, initially they were for Indian fighting only. And then during the Mexican War, former Texas Rangers fought under federal authority. They were listed into technically part of the U.S. Army in fighting in Mexico. And then they were again defenders beyond their regular law enforcement duties, which of course went on from the 1870s on. But as I said, starting with the Mexican Revolution, they were working on the Texas border for one reason, to try to preserve American neutrality in the matter. I mean, they sought out weapons smugglers, and they also, of course, worked to prevent the incursion of Mexican either revolutionaries or bandits into the Big Bend and other places on the border. Well, the next of the four roles that they fulfilled was as enforcers. And as I said, the Frontier Battalion enforced the statutes on the books at the times. The organization that was actually technically known as the State Rangers between the period of 1902 and 1835 were enforcers. And then finally, since 1935, the Texas Department of Public Safety has been obviously involved in enforcing. A less known role would be the third one, which is as explorers. A ranger by the name of Samuel Highsmith, working with Captain Jack Hayes, who was one of the most famous of the 19th century, perhaps the most famous of the 19th century Texas Rangers, blazed the trail from San Antonio to El Paso, and then that paved the way actually for the 49ers to make their way to the West Coast. So it was a important deal. Captain J.W. Arrington up in the Texas Panhandle not only explored the Panhandle, but escorted survey crews across the Panhandle. I've heard a story that some rangers used to carry pecans and scatter pecans along creekways and riverways in their regular patrols, hoping to propagate more pecan trees in Texas. I never found anything in writing about that, so it may just be an unproven story. Then when railroads started coming to Texas, they played a role in that, guarding the railroad construction and that sort of thing. And finally, they evolved into another role, which is being a referee. You know, they guarded district court proceedings when things looked dicey, like there might be a lynching. They guarded jails to prevent breakouts or lynchings. They monitored elections to try to keep them clean. And they did, later on, in my era as a reporter, they did a lot of demonstration calming, is what I'll call it, against those who were protesting the the Vietnam War. So I've come to what I consider 4 great truths about the Rangers that you may or may not know about. The first one is, as I said, they were Indian fighters, but the bigger part of that is that for the first 80 years of their history, they were known variously as spies, mounted riflemen, mounted spies, mounted volunteers, militiamen, state troops, state rangers, and so the use of the single term ranger evolved probably by the 30s, late 30s on. But prior to that, in newspapers, it's more common to see state rangers used. Another great truth is they have always performed better when they had skilled, honest leadership, and they did not always have that, and well-chosen men, and now, of course, women in the ranks. It was also equally important for them to have good funding, the best equipment possible, and a well-organized command structure. Also, as I mentioned earlier with the Fergusons, there's a strong correlation between politics and the effectiveness of the Rangers. The more political they were under a specific governor, the less effective they were and the less respected. And finally, not all Rangers wore white hats, both literally and figuratively. Frank Hamer did not wear a white hat. He always wore a black hat, as did another legendary Ranger who's less known, except for an interesting first name, and that is Zeno, Z-E-N-O, Smith. So I guess his parents said, you know, since our name's Smith, we may as well give him a little something on the front end. And so, but Zeno only wore black hats, and he served up into the late 1960s, and maybe even early 70s. So the Rangers have done a lot for Texas, but as you know, they have been in yet another fight, and it's gone on for years, but it got particularly bad as the bicentennial approached, and that is the culture wars. There are those who would portray, especially the early Texas Rangers, as nothing but practitioners of genocide, that they were out there deliberately trying to get rid of every Native American in Texas, that they supported the concept of slavery and worked very hard to do that. Well, no, I still think that the truth is most of those Rangers, especially during the Indian fighting era, were not interested in mass extinction. They were interested in protecting their families and their friends and other citizens of Texas from the raids. So anyway, it's way overbroad to many of the complaints that have been levied against the Rangers are way overbroad. Now, that's not to say that there were not some things that no Ranger could be proud of. One of the worst examples leads to another adventure I had, and that was what's known as the Porvenir Massacre. And in 1918, both during the Mexican Revolution and during World War I, as I said, there were several bandit incursions into Texas, and several of them proved deadly, with Texans being killed. And so a company of Rangers, accompanied by some U.S. soldiers, swept down a little small village on the river called Porvenir. And in the dead of night, they rounded up the men, even old men, and young boys, and took them to a location out of town and just executed them. I mean, they just shot them, killed them. So years later, I wanted to see that site. Now there's a historical marker there, and it's been better documented than it was at the time that I went there. But I had 2 friends, both of whom were retired sheriffs, and they agreed to not only take me to the site, but serve as my bodyguard, because by this time the border was not to the extent that it is today, but still drug smuggling was very, very common. And so one of my guides said, now be sure and bring some of your books, because if we encounter the Border Patrol and they've got sensors set up all over, they'll probably find us. They'll want to know what 3 white guys are doing down there walking around, on the edge of the river. And so sure enough, after a bit, out in the middle of nowhere, we were confronted by a couple of Border Patrol agents. And my sheriff friends explained that I was a writer and working on another book. And so I gave each of the Border Patrol officers a copy of the book. And at one point they said, well, are you guys armed? And we replied, yes. And he said, good. So anyway, it was something of an adventure. I'm here to report that I did not get shot or otherwise molested. But he said that we could count on the fact that the drug cartel folks had people just on the other side of the river where we were watching our every move. I could go on and on with the adventures. Time's running nigh. I do like a quote by Elmer Kelton that I think sort of speaks to this issue of how we perceive the Rangers. And he says, where I find the most fault with many of today's revisionist writers, and you could replace writer with historian, either word would work, is in their penchant for seeing our forebears' pioneering experiences only in the darkest terms. Surely it must be possible to exalt the minority viewpoints of the Western experience without automatically condemning the whole white male pioneers to perdition. And I think that's true. The truth about the Texas Rangers is right smack dab in the middle. There were some bad Rangers, but an awful lot of good Rangers. And I believe that the good Rangers certainly carried the day and have done more for Texas than certainly, of course, the bad Rangers. And the majority is right there. Finally, I showed you that book, and I have copies for sale in the back of the room. But I would ask you this, most of you, I'm sure, are quite familiar with the term AI for artificial intelligence, right? Sure. Okay, but have you ever heard of AS? No. Well, that is artificial stupidity. And I believe I may have invented the term. And that's because that the software program that was used to lay out my latest book, which is that Boots, Badges, and Bullets, so enjoyed some of my sentences that it decided through its artificial intelligence to repeat them for the pleasure of other readers. And so there are some sections of the book where there is a paragraph, you would find a paragraph that either the paragraph has been repeated or a sentence has been repeated. And then in addition, there's some other typographical mistakes. They are in the process of being corrected. And so I've got the rare flawed edition of my new Ranger book. I'm selling it for half price. I'm just happy to, you can still read it and you can still learn things about the history of the Texas Rangers, and you can still read and I hope and enjoy some stories of my Texas Ranger adventures.